This is Building a Forum with Rails 5 and Material Design Part 4. At the request of a subscriber, I have zoomed in considerably so that the font is bigger. Please let me know in the comments if it looks good, if it's too big, if it's too small, whatever, and we'll try to make as many people happy as possible. In this episode, we are going to talk about how we can authorize different users to take different actions inside the application. So if we look back, I just started back my server. If we look back at our application, we're logged in with Twitter. We can create new discussions. We can do different things. So let's get started. So first of all, let's jump back to the code and let's remind ourselves of a few things. And when I say ourselves, I mean myself, because I don't remember everything that we've done so far. So a lot of times I like to open up the database schema and take a look at what exists in the table so far. So we want to set up a relationship between the users and discussions, because what we want to do is basically say everybody can see all the discussions. However, you can't edit a discussion, you can't delete a discussion unless you own it. So in order to do that, we need to add a foreign key to the discussions table that basically says, like, if my user ID is 5 and the discussion has a user ID that equals 5, it means that I own it. So let's do that. And let me go ahead and zoom in here too before I forget. So that should be pretty okay, hopefully. Okay, so back in the terminal, let's start our server. And we're going to create a new migration. And to do that, we're going to say Rails G migration, add user ID to discussions. And the critical thing here, and you don't even have to do this, but if you want to get the auto magical properties of Rails to work right, you just need the table name. So we have a discussions table. It needs to match the last word of the migration. Then we can say what we want to add. So we're going to say user ID integer. And that created our migration for us. Now we can say Rails DB migrate, and that should add a user ID. And actually, I'm going to roll that back. And I'll show you why. So that did properly create our database migration, and it did add the user ID to the discussions table. But I also want to add an index here. And I'm not going to get into exactly what that is at the moment, but anytime you have a foreign key like this, you typically want to add an index. And it basically, we're going to be using these indexes to look things up in the database pretty often, and it makes that a lot faster. So for now, if you have a foreign key, you typically want to add an index. So now let's migrate again, and we should be good to go. Okay, so let's start back our server while we're here. Let's jump back to the code. And we don't need that migration open anymore. I don't need this schema open anymore. We need to set up our relationship between our user and our discussion. So in our user file, up at the top, you can put it where you want. You want to say has many discussions. So the has many, well, hold on, let's go to the discussion. So this is known as a has many belongs to relationship. So in the discussion, we want to say belongs to user. The belongs to goes wherever you put the foreign key. That's just the way it works. And then on the opposite side of it, you want to say has many. Okay, so with that, we should be able to start implementing some rules. So let's open up our controller for discussions. So when we create a discussion, we're calling discussion.new. And this just creates an empty discussion with our params. Now we could go back to our form and add a user ID in there and pass that in through the params, but that's really not the way you want to handle this. So what we will actually want to do is say current user dot discussions dot new. So now when we do this, this automatically includes the user ID in the new discussion that gets built. But I don't want you to take my word for this. So let's jump back to the terminal. I'm going to stop my server and I'm going to run Rails C. So I'm going to say user equals, well, let's actually use the same variable name. So this is not the current user because we're not logged in, we're just in the console, but I'm going to call it the same variable name just for continuity. So we'll say current user equals user.first. So we're simulating that the first or the current user is the first one. So we'll say current user dot discussions, and this should return back to us an empty array. And you can see here that it tried to load the discussions out of the database. If I say current user dot discussions dot new, it's going to give me back a new discussion record. Everything is blank except the user ID is 1. So anytime I tell you something, try to jump over in the terminal and see if you can figure out how to just write the code directly there and get a sense for how what you're actually working with. Okay, so back, let me start my server back. Back in our code, let's try this out, I guess. So if we go back to, make sure I have saved that file actually, sorry for bouncing around so much. So if I refresh here, and I create a new discussion, and we'll just say owned discussion 1, content, it's just some stuff. We'll save that and go back, and then I'm gonna go back to my console, open a new tab so I don't have to stop the server. We'll run Rails C and we'll check the last discussion. And it has a user ID of 1. If I do user.first.discussions, you can see that that shows up. Perfect. Alright, so we're actually almost there with this episode, so there's not a lot left to do. If we go over to our discussions controller, one curious thing is that we have this before action set discussion, and the reason we have this is because we use this scaffolding, and this is what automatically gets created. So what this is doing is if you scroll down, there's a set discussion private method which says discussion find. Now this is actually a little bit of a dangerous piece of code here because this is not taking into account a current user, and it will let anybody, regardless of whether they're even logged in, just do things on the app. So we can handle this. There's a few things we can do. First of all, I'm going to change this to say set owned discussion, and we're going to do kind of what we did before. We're going to say current user dot discussions, and this is what's known as scoping. So that means that the only discussions that could possibly get returned to us are ones that this user owns. So we're going to call set owned discussions, and we're only going to do this on edit, update, and destroy. And the reason we don't want to do show is because we really want anybody to be able to look at a discussion. We don't even want them to have to be logged in or anything. So we can say at discussion equals discussion.find params ID. And that's what we had down below. And so now everything should function properly. So let's go back to the browser and let's try this out. So let's see, that's really slow. Is that running? Yes, it is. It's just slow. Okay, so if I click show, it should be just fine. If I click edit, because this first discussion, nobody owns it. You know, there's no user ID. So if I click edit, I should get an error actually. Yeah, so it's telling me I can't find that thing. So also the same thing with destroy. If I click destroy, it's going to prompt me, are you sure? And then it's going to throw an error and say, oh, I can't find that because you're not the current user that owns that. You're not the user that owns that. So one thing we could do, and we will do, is we will hide these buttons or links so that you cannot access them unless you own them. but you could still technically visit this page and it's still going to throw an error. So I want to handle that. And there's a couple of ways we could do it. In our set own discussion, we could say begin, rescue, so on and so forth, and that would prevent the error. Let's actually see what happens when we do this. So I'm just going to redirect to root path, and I'm going to give a flash warning. You don't have access to that. So let's see what happens. So if I just try to refresh this, I'm going to get redirected back, and I don't have a flash message anywhere. Let me fix that. So if we open up our index for discussions, so I guess I could put it in the notice maybe. That'll be okay for now. Flash notice. And let's refresh. Let's try to edit. Oh, I do actually own that one. Sorry. So if I go to the first one again, it's just going to tell me I don't have access to that. We'll style this out later, but that's okay for now. If I try to destroy it, let me refresh so that message goes away and we can see that this works. If I try to destroy it, it's going to tell me the same thing. So that's not a terrible solution. One thing you don't want to do is just rescue everything. So for now, let's actually comment all this out. Try it again. And we'll just try to edit the first one, and it's going to say active record, record not found. So if we copy this, we only really want to be rescuing that because we expect that to happen. So that is, we could actually do this to E, and then let's see, what is this? So E puts the actual error message inside of a variable. So we should be able to do logger.info E. We may want to do something like put a bunch of equal signs above and below so it's easy to spot. Let's try this out. So if I just refresh this page, it should kick me back and tell me I don't have access, and then in my server it puts the error message between the equal signs. So couldn't find discussion with ID where user ID equals 1. Alright, so that's pretty good. Let's see. So I want to try a couple other things. So, you know, I don't know if you would really do this in a production app, you might, but this could be interesting. So if you said, if a user logged in, we could say logger.info current user.name trying to edit discussion, and then we'll say params ID, comma, but they don't own it. So this is in case you want to spy on your logged in users. So current user name is, so let's refresh, and let's just try to edit, and let's see what the message says now. Stephen Pfizer is trying to edit discussion 1, but they don't own it. So now you can log out information about what everybody's trying to do. Okay, so let's do a couple more quick things. So that's pretty good for just making sure that whoever's trying to modify things in the database owns it. We also want to make sure just generally that anybody who's trying to do something that interacts with the database is actually logged in. So we need to open up application controller, and we're just going to write a little method that first of all we're going to do something. It's going to say before action let's just call it validate user, or let's do this, authenticate user, and we can put an exclamation point because that's typically how some of these gems you see define it. And we'll just say def authenticate user, and we'll say if, well, unless user logged in, we'll say flash notice equals you need to log in, and we'll redirect to the root path. So let's try this. So in order to use this, so basically everything has this right now, and we don't want that. So if we go up to our discussions, we'll say skip before action, and we want to say only, hold on, authenticate user. So we're going to skip this only on the index and the show action. So in other words, you don't have to be signed in to look at the home page, and you don't have to be signed in to look at something, but everything else you have to be signed in for. So let's go back and let's sign out, and we can still get here, we can still look at things, but if I try to edit it, it's going to kick me back and say, hey, you need to log in. If I try to start a new discussion, it's going to kick me back and say, hey, you need to log in. And just to verify, if I log in with Twitter, well, actually, I screwed that up. We need to go to our sessions controller, and we want to skip before action authenticate user, and we want to do that only on the new action. So if I click sign in with Twitter now, it'll kick me back and say, hey, that's okay, and now I'm in. Cool. So basically what happened there was, back in the sessions controller, it was trying to call, so I don't know if I said this, but I should. Anything you put in the application controller as a before action will happen before every action in the system that inherits from application controller. So our sessions controller does inherit from application controller, and so it was trying to authenticate the user while it was trying to authenticate the user, and it says like, oh, you're not logged in, you can't do that, and so we need to skip that, obviously, so that you can actually log in. Okay, so the last thing I want to do, and I want to point out that this is the last thing that we're doing, not the first thing. I want to just hide the stuff in the view that's not relevant to the user. And the reason I point out this is the last thing is sometimes people start with this and then it looks like your system is secure, but it's actually not, because you need to handle it at the controller level first. So if we open up discussions index, so what we're going to do is say, this is not going to be the prettiest HTML right now, and that's okay because we're not going to keep this in its exact form in the first place. So we'll just say if current user dot discussions, hold on, actually let's think about this. Let's say if current user owns discussion, and then we'll pass in discussion. And then we'll do this, and we'll do this, and that's it. Now obviously this method doesn't exist, and if we go refresh the page, it will blow up. Say that doesn't exist. So let's write that method on the user model. So just at the bottom we'll say def owns discussion question mark, and it takes the discussion as an argument. So this is getting to be a little bit of a long episode, and I didn't expect that it would, but this is really useful. So there's a couple of ways we can do this. So we have this discussions has many thing at the top. So what we could do is say something like discussions dot include discussion. And this is pretty. And let's run it. And it works. And so I accidentally signed in with a different Twitter account, so I don't own either one of these discussions, and so it doesn't show up. And if I start a new one, say third discussion, put some junk in there, we'll go back to the home page. Again, it's not pretty, but you can see that this works. One thing I would point out though is that if we look at our SQL that's being executed here, so we're making multiple. So we have a list of 3. We can see that we have some queries here. So this is actually really not great because this discussions include discussion. So this discussions variable, whenever we call that, it queries the database, and we don't want that. So there's a kind of a shortcut we can take here because the discussion has a user ID on it, and the discussion or the user obviously has an ID. So what we can do to kind of short circuit this, instead of querying the database, even though this code looks nicer, it doesn't perform well. So what we could change this to be, let me actually comment that out and then put this underneath. We can say ID equals discussion.userID. So now I'm going to go back, I'm going to refresh, I'm going to get the same exact result, but now you can see that we don't have all these queries over here. So this is something, as you're learning, you don't want to be doing this. You don't want to, if you see SQL queries just streaming, it's a big red flag and you need to pay attention to it. And so again, like, this code is a lot less, quote, pretty. It doesn't read like English like, a lot of Ruby code does. I mean, it's not bad, but you can imagine like scenarios where it gets a little more complex and it's a little harder to understand, but it performs much better. So anyway, I digress, but that's a little bit of a performance discussion. Okay, so now we have this owns discussion method, and we can no longer edit or destroy things if we don't own it. And then down here, we just want to say if user logged in. And we'll put an in tag on here. And that should be it. So, well, I'm logged in, so I can. So let me sign out. Aha, undefined method owns discussion. Well, that's tricky. So I'm glad I tried that. So what I'm going to do is say if user logged in and alright, so now we can see post and the index when we are logged out. When I sign in, I can see the edit and destroy for the discussion that I own, and I can start new discussions. We can edit this and we can make sure we can update it. Alright, so that's it for this episode. Remember to click like and remember to subscribe, and I'll talk to you next time.